Ok, sono stato informato che l'ora è giunta e possiamo dunque incominciare, quindi procederei in modo tale da essere puntuali e lasciare poi tutto lo spazio possibile alla conversazione. Come sapete, la nostra ospite questa sera è appunto straniera, è francese appunto e non parla italiano, quindi per ragioni, come dire, di mutua comprensione passerò immediatamente all'inglese, procederò a fare una presentazione, una breve introduzione e poi le lascerò la parola. So, good afternoon everyone. And thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to open up this session, which is titled Il femminismo di fronte alla guerra, which has been translated in this case in Feminism and Gender in the Face of War. And before spending a few words, introducing today's topic, I would like to briefly introduce the speaker. So, Dr. Élise Feron is a docent and senior research fellow at the Tampere Peace Research Institute in Finland, where she also lectured in the master program in peace, mediation and conflict research. Before moving to Finland, Élise held permanent positions at the University of Kent in Britain and at Sciences Po Lille in France. And in the past, Élise also had a visiting professorship position here at the University of Turin. She was teaching in this very campus. And she has been a regular lecturer in the Engaging Conflict Summer School program, which has been run here as well. Her main research interests include feminist peace research, conflict generator diaspora politics, as well as the aftermath of war. And she has collected data in various areas such as Eastern Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, Northern Ireland, Cyprus, the South Caucasus, Madagascar, among other places. Naturally, she published extensively on the subjects of her research, so you can find many publications, books, edited volumes, and articles with her name on it. So if after today's conversation you're interested to know more, there's the opportunity to do that. Now, having introduced the speaker, let's move back on the topic of her speech. Today, Élise will help us in exploring an issue which is often mentioned, I would say, but perhaps not so often unpacked in all of its complexity. And that's the relationship between gender, feminism, and war. I would not frame myself as an expert on this very specific subject because I do have a background in strategic studies, so when I think of war, I most conventionally focus on, strategies, tools, weapons, and outcomes. And these are, of course, very important elements of war. Nowadays, every time you read a newspaper, every time you switch on your TV, whatever you follow on social media accounts, you realize how these, hard power, material element of war, it's very relevant. But that doesn't mean it's the only relevant thing. And also we need to pay attention to the social structures that shape and influence the way in which war is waged, whom is hurt by war and how. And gender in particular remains a very powerful lens through which it is possible to understand not only how the battlefield is formed, the roles assigned to those who fight and those who don't, but also the stories that justify the roles assumed on the battlefield and around it. This perspective also allows to make sense about how the memory of war is carried over after a war and how the post-conflict phase is managed, how the social scars left behind by the conflict are healed or not, and how the transition from peace to war and from war to peace reshapes gender relations. I would like to stress out, in particular, that today's topic is not just about the victimization of women in war, although that certainly is a very important part of the subject, but it's also about how the idea of masculinity and femininity are mobilized and militarized, and how power is generated and negotiated through the bodies of those involved. So, through Élise's presentation, we will be asked to reconsider what violence is, how it operates, and to what effect on whom, and who benefits or is damaged from a certain way of organizing and wielding violence. In a speech, Élise will guide us driving from years of research at the intersection of peace and conflict studies, gender studies, conflict transformation, and peace building. And having had the privilege of knowing Élise for quite a while and speaking with her, I'm confident that what she's going to share with us today is not just going to be knowledge, but also a series of critical tools useful to unlearn what we have taken for granted so far and useful to reimagine what both war and peace could mean. So I think I've taken too much time already, and without further ado, I'm very happy to leave the floor to Élise for a lecture. So thank you, Élise.
Thank you so much, Stefano. Good afternoon, everybody. I apologize in advance. My voice is a bit broken. I was just sick for a while, so I hope I won't cough too much during my talk. I will do my best. Let me first say that I'm very pleased to be here. And I think also that the topic that I'm going to talk about today is very important. You may disagree with me, with some of the things I say. You may agree with some of it. But I think nevertheless it's important to discuss these issues, especially right now. Why? Because there's a lot of talk, as I'm sure you've seen, about war, potential, world war, maybe, or another regional war. And there's also a lot of talk, especially in Europe, about rearmament and the need to rearm our societies and militarize our societies, and the changing geopolitical dynamics that we are facing nowadays with a lot of uncertainties. We also speak a lot about the economic and political consequences of rearming. For instance, what will happen to our social budgets if we buy a lot of new weapons, for instance? Will there be enough money for education, social services, and so on and so forth? But in all these discussions, what I find quite puzzling is that there is very little talk about what wars do to our societies and to our culture. What do they do, for instance, in terms of gender equality? What do they do in terms of gender role models? And what we know, and I'm going to talk a bit about this, is that wars feed on ultra-conservative and ultra-traditional gender role models. And the consequences of these are not necessarily well thought through, in my view. So in this presentation, basically, what I'm going to do is to try to explain why we need a feminist perspective, why we need a gender perspective to make sense of war and of the war talk we are witnessing today. So this is a very broad topic, of course, and I won't be able to I won't be able to cover everything. So I've chosen to put the focus on four main questions that I will talk about in turn. And hopefully these four main questions will show you why wars are deeply gendered events. And it's impossible, and I strongly believe that, it's impossible to understand war dynamics without gender, without an understanding of gender. So the first question I'm going to talk about is how do wars and violent conflicts feed on gender stereotypes? You already have a very good example in the picture I put on the slide here. It's from the Second World War in the US. The second question I'm going to talk about is how do gender norms in turn shape the treatment of soldiers and civilians during war? The third question, which I think is really interesting, is how does feminism resist militarization and war? What can we do in order to resist militarization and war? And finally, because all feminists are not pacifist, we will have to discuss and we will look at the dilemmas that feminist activists face in the face of war. How do feminists react? For instance, nowadays in Ukraine, how do feminists react to the war? So let me start by talking a bit about gender norms and war. I think I'm not going to surprise any of you when I say that war and conflicts are heavily masculinized. When you think about all the symbols, when you think about all the discourses about war, about the military, we think about guns, we think about soldiers, preferably male soldiers, we think about physical strength, we think about battlefields, and all of these arenas, all of these elements are heavily masculine, if you want. And what is very important as well is that when we look at war narratives, when we look about how we talk about war and how we talk, for instance, about advances on the battlefield or retreat on the battlefield, the language that is used is very gendered as well. What we find very often is that, for instance, the enemy is feminized, that we tend to look at the enemy, or they are sissies, or they can be weaker than us, or they are not as courageous as we are. And on the contrary, the defenders of the nation, so our soldiers, for instance, they are masculinized. So we have this valorization of, the soldier as a strong man. But the problem is that, of course, these are all stereotypes. These are all images that do not necessarily correspond to reality. I will come back later to that. But it's also very important to understand that it's not because conflict and war are masculinized that they only impact men, of course. So conflicts and wars have deep impact on all genders, right? But those impacts are not necessarily the same. Why? Simply because, as for instance, men and women and people of other genders, we have different functions, we have different roles in society. So if, for instance, the majority of people fighting on the front line are men, then the impact on fighting on the front line will be heavier on men than it is on women, for instance. So for instance, even if you think in terms of bombing, you would say, well, bombing doesn't have a gender effect, does it? Well, actually, bombing does have a gender effect. Why? Because usually the cities that are being bombed are mostly inhabited by women and children and the elderly, because the men of war-fighting age are not in those cities anymore, right? So when you think about bombing, it's only normal that I'm not justifying it, of course, but it's just logical that those who will be the first affected will be women and children. And likewise, if you think about fighting on the front line, as I was mentioning earlier, it's the great majority of those who die on the front line are men. And that's normal because that's where men are fighting, right? So when we think about war and conflict, we really have to think that the impact of wars and conflicts are really gendered, and that we cannot treat wars as having the same impact on everybody. So we have to keep those two elements in mind. So on the one hand, that wars and conflicts feed on those gender images. I will come back to them. And on the other hand, that wars and conflicts also have very gendered impacts. One of the main narratives that we hear when we talk about wars and conflicts is that men fight and women are victims. This is a statement that I particularly dislike. Why? Well, first of all, because both men and women fight, sometimes in different ways. I'll come back to that. And both men and women are victims. But we have this narrative. And this narrative, I want you to understand that it has a function. It is the narrative that presents men as the ones defending the nation, as the ones fighting for the nation, and protecting the vulnerable ones, which are the women. You understand? Or which are assumed to be the women, of course. This is also something that is a very strong patriarchal assertion when we talk about war. This is the assumption that women are in need of protection. So people, and in particular feminists, who always put the stress on the vulnerability of women, they are actually playing the patriarchal script. I'm not saying here that women are not victims of conflicts. Of course they are, and I will come back to that in a minute. But constantly putting the stress on the vulnerability of women is actually reinforcing the patriarchal narrative that calls for men to protect them and that valorizes the strength of men and therefore furthers the vicious cycle, if you wish. I'll come back to all these elements afterwards. And of course, if you have questions, I'll be happy to discuss that. So one of the main images on which war is built is masculinity. As I just said, men in particular are supposed to defend the nation and to protect its purity. I wonder how many people in this room here have ever questioned the fact that conscription in many countries is limited to men. Why would it be men who defend their countries? Don't women care? Aren't they good fighters? Actually, there are a lot of very interesting studies that show that, for instance, women are much better snipers than men. They are more precise, more careful, and so on and so forth. So if you think in terms of the characteristics of a good combatant, women could be very, very good combatants. They might be less strong physically, but they compensate with other qualities and other skills that they have. But in spite of this, there is this assumption that those who should go and fight should be men. And it is very seldom questioned. It's kind of obvious. Oh, okay, those who are going to fight and defend the country, we think about young men, right? Or not so less young men. But it's always men. And this image of the combatants is linked to a very specific type of masculinity, which is called in academia militarized masculinity. And militarized masculinity is very special. It's not just masculinity in general. It's a masculinity that is linked to knowing how to use a weapon, first of all, but also to be physically strong and, being able to take pain, that you're not weak. You can take pain. You are unyielding. You are steadfast, but you are also loyal. By loyal, meaning you obey orders, the idea of a good soldier. But what is particularly also important when we think about the concept of militarized masculinity is that it also legitimizes the use of physical force. If we value the image of the soldier, we also value the use of physical force. We might say, oh, but it's normal, it's because we need to defend ourselves. But actually, still, it is a legitimization of the use of physical force, of physical violence. And what is also very important is that use of physical force is, of course, legitimized both on men and on women. So the image of the soldier, for instance, is the image in a society at war in particular. And we see that, for instance, in countries that are at war and which value leaders that are viewed as strong men. For instance, we very often see them in uniforms when they give speeches, or in election campaigns. During election campaigns, they have those military uniforms. So this image of the strong man, which is valued by militarized countries or countries at war, is an image that puts the use of physical force or the potential to use physical force as one of the main values we expect in men, right? And so it's at the expense of other forms of masculinity. It's not just at the expense of femininities and women. It's also at the expense of other forms of masculinity, for instance, more peaceful masculinities, or masculinities that are less oriented on the physical traits, of a man, but that might also be valuing knowledge, for instance, or other types of physical skills. So in the context of war, masculinities are, of course, very, very important. And any attack on the group is perceived as an attack on the manhood of the group and on the masculinity of the group. So, for instance, if you look at war narratives when there is a big defeat, it's always seen as a humiliation, and we have to retaliate because it's an issue of honor. So the language that is used when there are attacks or when there are defeats is a language that is very much related to masculinity. And defeat is very often seen as a synonym, or very often used as a synonym for a loss of masculinity. We have to regain our honor. We have to regain our pride, which is another way to say we have to regain our manhood, right? If we have been defeated. So I don't want to go into psychological or psychiatric interpretations of wars, but there are many academics that have, for instance, looked at the humiliation of certain countries after the Second World War and after the First World War as well, as a reason for nationalism, in particular, for instance, in Germany after the First World War, as a reason explaining for the rise of nationalism in between the two world wars, for instance. And this is, of course, related to masculinity issues. What is interesting to think about also when we think about masculinity and war is that again, not every man is equal in front of war. Why? Because when we think about war and we always think about soldiers. We always think about combatants, but there are men who don't fight, and in general, wars disempower civilian men or men who refuse to fight. We have many examples throughout history where men who were pacifists or who refused to fight for any number of reasons, which could be health-related or religious-related and so on and so forth, who were shamed by the rest of the society because they did not want to fight. For instance, during the First World War in the UK, there were women who women who spent their time tracking men of age fighting, who were of age fighting, and would shame them, in the street and denounce them and call their names, saying, you shouldn't be here, you should be on the front line fighting, right? And here, I'm just saying this in parenthesis because it really shows how women participate as well in this. So the equation that we sometimes hear about women, they are pro-peace and men, they are pro-war, it's just not true. And the same happens today in Ukraine. I suppose some of you know that men of war-fighting age are not allowed out of Ukraine today, right? And men who, for whatever reason, do not fight also face a lot of backlash from their own society, from their own wives, sisters, mothers, and so on and so forth, because they refuse to fight. So I just want to really put the stress on this, that it's not all men who benefit from war, far from it, and actually war is imposed on many men. Right? So when we use this distinction, men fight and women are victims, we tend to forget that many men who fight are actually victims themselves, right? And we have to keep that in mind. So as I said, war is particularly hard on civilian men. Why? Because it disempowers civilian men. It means that very often, for instance, if they had a farm or if they were working in a firm or something like this, very often they cannot keep their jobs. So that means that they cannot be the breadwinners anymore. They cannot bring money to the household anymore. And so there is a lot of pressure, put upon those men to prove their masculinity. If you don't fight, if you don't bring money in, then what are you good for? Well, I'm not serious, of course, but this is the kind of problems that they face. And so what we see very often is that those civilian men will eventually, many of them, join the army or an armed group as a way to regain a status, right? As a way to regain their dignity, if you want. But there are great risks, of course, to joining the army or to joining an armed group, because men, like it or not, they are the first victims of conflicts. And here I know that some feminists in the room might not like what I'm saying, but this is the truth. Around 80% nowadays, and it used to be even more, around 80% of people killed in conflict are men. So I'm not saying that women are not victims. I will come back to that again later, but they are a lot less likely to be killed than men. So if being killed doesn't make you a victim, I don't know what does. So when we think about what wars do to people, we have to think that, those who pay with their lives because of wars are men, first and foremost. You might still say, yes, but they are responsible for it. Well, I'm not sure that we can put all men in the same basket in that respect, because many of those men did not choose to fight. because of conscription, because of forced enrollment, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to move on from. I don't know how I'm doing with time, but okay. Okay, perfect. But I really want you to understand the centrality of masculinities when we think about war, and the way it is putting pressure on men, but also how it is shaping the images and the discourses around war. So let me talk a bit about femininities in times of war. Usually, when we talk about femininity, it is associated with weakness and passivity. I mentioned that already. Women, they are in need of protection. They are super weak. We don't know how to defend ourselves, obviously, right? We don't know anything, and we need to have a man to protect us and to provide for us. That's the traditional view. The problem is that this vision, that women are weak and that they are in need of protection, it justifies all sorts of violence that are done on women, and it justifies all sorts of exclusion of women. So if you are weak, if we know nothing about war, then we can be excluded from any kind of decision-making processes regarding war. We can be excluded from any type of involvement, real agency, field involvement in war. And likewise, as I mentioned earlier, men who are not masculine enough, they are feminized. For instance, conscientious objectors, they are feminized. They are seen as not men enough, meaning by this, they are not men enough to fight, to have the courage to fight, right? So you see here that the gender constructions are very important for understanding how people are treated during wars. But what is interesting when we think about women and war is that they have a very ambivalent image. So as I said, they have this passivity, weakness, lack of agency image on the one hand, but on the other hand, they are also used to justify the fighting. The way men are convinced to go and fight, or at least traditionally, conventionally, is because men are called upon to protect the women and children. So if men fight, it is because of this image of passivity and weakness of women. You have to go, because otherwise who's going to protect the women? Who's going to protect the villages? Who's going to protect the local communities? And so the women are, they are, as I said, they have this dual representation, passive, weak, in need of protection. And on the other hand, they symbolize the thing that men have to protect. They have to fight for it. So they symbolize the nation, they symbolize the community, and they symbolize the group that is in need of protection. So I'm sure you've already noticed that very often nations are feminine. I think Italy is a woman, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, France is a woman as well. The US is a woman. Most societies around the world, the nation that has to be protected is a woman. But of course, the image to protect the woman. So, for instance, think about the memorials to wars, for instance. Very often it's a male soldier, defending the woman who represents the nation. So what is interesting is that in all these discourses, the military presence of women is systematically downplayed. So when we talk about armies, it's as if women were not part of those armies. I mentioned it on the next slide, but we depend in national armies, women represent around 5% of the combatants in conventional armies, right? I'm talking here just about combatants. I'm not talking about women who are in support tasks, like, for instance, as nurses or cooks or secretaries or information officers and so on and so forth. Just combatants, 5%. But if you take into account the non-state armed groups, so, not armies, but for instance, paramilitaries or non-state armed groups in general, it's around 25% of the combatants who are women. And sometimes that number climbs up to 40%, depending on the setting, right? So even if you even if you don't take into account these extreme cases where you have 40% of female combatants, the contribution of women to fighting is not negligible. It's actually like a very large part. And as I said before, increasingly in modern armies, women are specifically recruited to perform certain tasks that they are better at doing than men, right? So, but in spite of that, so that is the reality of the figures, if you want. But in spite of that, when we think about armies, when we talk about armies, when you read articles about armies, it's very often very masculine. So we don't see they are erased, if you want, from the narratives. Yes. So as I did for men, I would like also to talk about civilian women. So civilian women pay a heavy price for wars. As I said before, it's not because they are less skilled than men that they are not victims as well. So they pay a very heavy price because they have to take on responsibilities very often that men have left behind. So they become the main breadwinners for their families. They become the heads of households. They also do a lot of unpaid care work in their own families. For instance, for the elderly parents, or if their husband comes back from, or brother or son comes back from war, amputated, or with a very heavy wounds. So they have to do that. We also observe during war a feminization of poverty. I mean, women, as we know, women are the majority of the poor people in the world, but during wars, it's even worse. It gets even worse, that they have a lot of difficulty feeding their own families and so on and so forth. As I said, civilian women face increased risks, related to the need to protect their families, but also because they face increased forced displacement. So for instance, if you think in terms of forced displacement, around 80% of those who are forcefully displaced are either women or children, right? So it's very important to think in different types of violence when you think about war. As I said before, who is killed? Mostly men. Who is forcefully displaced? Mostly women. So different types of violence affect people differently. And it's important to keep that in mind, to have a clear head about what we're talking about. They are also sometimes victims of forced recruitment, because what happens in many countries that have been at war for a long time is that after a while, they run out of male combatants. There are just too many men who are killed. And so, or maimed, or, injured and incapacitated. So what they do is that they start recruiting women, but forcefully, because, there are not necessarily many women who enroll voluntarily. So what is interesting to see is that when, during wars, and it's a bit paradoxical, academics say that it creates windows of opportunities for women. Why? Because men are gone. So they take more responsibilities. They learn to do things that they didn't do when their husband or father was there, because they have to run things by themselves. But on the other hand, very often those windows of opportunities, slap shut at the end of the war. Why? Because men come back from the war and they want things to go back to how they were before the war started. And also you have this very strong patriarchal and nationalist ideology that, is very present during the conflict. So what we see basically during wars is a deprioritization of gender equality, for instance, and a deprioritization of objectives that are important for women's well-being and sexual and gender minorities' well-being, and so on and so forth. And we also observe a censorship of some issues like domestic violence or sexual harassment in the military. For instance, it's a big issue in Ukraine nowadays, that those issues are not talked about, because there is this idea that if we talk about them, it's going to undermine the Ukrainian army, and the Ukrainian army needs all the strength it can get, and so we don't talk about those things, right? And obviously, it's an important issue. Something I haven't talked about yet is gender-based and sexual violence, and probably you were expecting this a bit earlier, but I thought I would speak specifically about it in a different section. I think gender-based and sexual violence during wartime is the best illustration we can find of the links between war and gender. Because in every war, in every conflict, don't listen to those who say otherwise. I've been working on these issues for more than 20 years. I have not seen any war or even minor conflict where there was not instances of sexual violence. Always. But what is interesting is that sexual violence displays different characteristics when it's exerted against women and against men. Because yes, men also are victims of sexual violence. We estimate that it depends, of course, on the case, but we estimate that around a third of all victims of sexual violence in conflict zones are men. A third, 33%, right? But the thing is, first of all, we don't talk about it because of this humiliation that it might trigger for men, but also most of these types of sexual violence against men are not reported. Why? Because men are less likely to be raped. And very often we make this equation between rape and sexual violence. In fact, sexual violence is a lot more than rape. It's also, for instance, beatings of the genital. It can be forced abortion, forced pregnancy, sexual slavery, and so on and so forth. And men are, especially when they are imprisoned, and it's the case, for instance, it was the case in Syria, in the Bashar al-Assad prisons, for instance, that around 80% of all men imprisoned in Syria had been victims of sexual violence in detention. And very often they were, I'm not going to go into the gruesome details because you're not there for that, but if you have specific questions, I can answer them. But they were mutilated, sometimes castrated, sometimes electric shocks to the genitals, and so on and so forth, and less often raped, right? And because they were less often raped, very often this was not counted as sexual violence, but it was sexual violence. On the other hand, yes, around 2/3 of all victims of wartime sexual violence are women. Yes, and women, yes, are more likely to be raped than they are to be victim of any other type of sexual violence. But they are also likely to be used as sexual slaves, to be victim of forced pregnancy, forced marriage, forced abortion, and so on and so forth. What is important to understand, and perhaps you've heard about the weapon of war theory, the idea that sexual violence is a weapon of war, is that indeed very often sexual violence is perpetrated on women in order to humiliate men. Why? Remember what I said before. I told you men, their function, their goal in life is to protect women, right? So if their women, daughter, mother, sister, whatever, is raped, then it means that they have failed in their mission of protectors, right? So there is a triangular relation there. So of course, it does not deny the fact that rape can be perpetrated because of, lust, for instance. But very often the idea is really that, we are going to show those men that they cannot even, protect their women, and we can do whatever we want with their women. So wartime sexual violence can be a very strong ethnic cleansing strategy, especially when women are victims of forced pregnancy, when women are raped repeatedly and kept in, for instance, like in what happened in Bosnia in the 1990s, that women were kept in what was called rape camps for months until it was too late for them to abort. And the idea was that then they will carry the children of the perpetrators who were of a different ethnic group, right? So here you have a very clear ethnic cleansing strategy because the children of those rapes were supposed to be of a different ethnic group. In that case, it was the Serbs, to be clear about who I'm talking about. But what is very important to understand when we talk about gender-based violence and sexual violence is that it takes its roots in peacetime. So basically, if soldiers feel comfortable enough, feel entitled to rape women or castrate men, it's also because those norms exist in peacetime. And in particular, the female body, or feminized bodies, less masculine bodies, if you want, they have always been seen in patriarchal societies as a territory to be owned and controlled by men. Look at all these men deciding how women can dress, whether they can have a veil or not, or whether their skirt is short enough or not long enough, whether the woman is overweight or not, or whether she has enough makeup or not, or if she's old enough to still, play in a movie, for instance, right? So there is this very strong control, of women's bodies and how they look. And most of the laws, even in peacetime, even in our societies, regarding women's bodies, for instance, regarding contraception, regarding abortion, and so on and so forth, they are taken by men. The problem is not so much what those laws say. It's, by whom, they've been decided. Anyway, so what is very important to understand when we talk about wartime gender-based and sexual violence is that they take their roots in there. And feminist work and feminist research, and I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation, has been very strong in showing how the types of violence we experience during war are related to the types of violence experienced before war in so-called peacetime. And that for women, we cannot strictly make a difference between peacetime and war times. That very often what they experience, like domestic violence or being raped or being, oppressed, is not very different during wartime than it is from what it is during peacetime, right? Okay, I'm taking too much time. I want to talk briefly about feminist resistance and activism. So here on the picture you have it's a very famous picture of the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, which lasted for 13 years between 1981 and 1999. It was so the Greenham Common Camp was a UK based. In a UK military base, where nuclear weapons were being stored, and women for 13 years protested against nuclear weapons in this camp. And the picture is from a protest in 82, where 35,000 women joined hands around the camp, and they surrounded the camp, joining hands to protest against the presence of nuclear weapons in that base. So I think this picture is very telling because it shows you the type of feminist resistance against war and against weapons that can be organized. Very often, these types of resistance are very embodied. Women use their bodies, they use their physical presence in order to protest weapons or wars. And they also do this very often locally. So they don't necessarily go to the capital cities and protest, but they will go to specific places, to specific communities in order to launch specific actions. So the tactics have been very diverse. From street campaigns, from those types of protests, peace camps, petitions, political parties, peace education, and so on and so forth. And there is not one blueprint, if you want, for feminist activism. But one of the, one of the issues that I want to mention is that there is feminist resistance against war, but there is also a lot of resistance against feminism, right? And they have had to counter that resistance by being very creative. For instance, sometimes media censors feminist protests or does not cover those protests properly. And so they have had to use creative tactics to still draw attention, to what they've been doing. But one of the main issues with feminist resistance and activism is that actually I've been talking about feminism, and I've been using that term since the beginning of my talk, as if we all agreed on what it means. Actually, feminism is very divided. And one of the main issues on which feminism is divided is war. Why? Because not all feminists are pacifists or anti-militarists. It depends on the country, of course. But in many parts of the world, especially in the global south, feminists will tell you being pacifist is a luxury that only white women can afford. We cannot be pacifist in front of oppression. We cannot be pacifist in front of an authoritarian rule that denies us any right, that takes our children from us, and so on and so forth, right? So I would say, I'm not saying that all feminists in the global south are pro-war. This is not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that there are lots of divisions and there are lots of ongoing discussions, at the global level between feminists on whether or not, we should support this or that war. And one of the main examples currently, of course, is the war in Ukraine, where a lot of Ukrainian feminists were particularly upset with Western European feminists because the Western European feminists, I don't know if it was the case in Italy, but it was the case, for instance, in Spain, during the first months of the Russian full invasion of Ukraine, they spent their time ranting against NATO and saying, we cannot, support the war of Ukraine against Russia because it's done with NATO weapons. And the Ukrainian feminists were like, what the hell are you saying? Why are you saying this? We don't care where the weapons come from. We have to defend ourselves, against military aggression. It's that or dying. So what should we do? And so there were lots of debates, and I would say a rift between especially Eastern European feminists and Western European feminists. Western European feminists saying, oh, no war, peace and love, right? And Eastern European feminists saying, well, you try living next to Russia, right? And we will see if you are still peace and love after that. The problem, of course, is that even when you are Ukrainian feminists, you are well aware of the fact that when we increase war spending, when we get involved in war, it means that we have less money for important issues like gender equality, but also social services, social support, education, healthcare, and so on and so forth. So there is a dilemma there, a very, very big dilemma, which is that on the one hand, we cannot condone the killing of people and we cannot condone wars because wars are masculinist endeavors, right? They are masculinist projects, if you want. But on the other hand, wars also threaten some of the values that are important to us, like, for instance, democracy, freedom of speech, and, simply being alive. And so for feminists, very often, war is seen as the last resort. And the work of many feminists nowadays, in Ukraine, but also elsewhere, we could talk about the Middle East, for instance, where feminists have been also quite active, is to say, okay, we have to fight. We think that military resistance is legitimate. But at the same time, we have to make sure that military resistance doesn't undermine, for instance, gender equality, or does not make things worse for gender and sexual minorities. So it's about finding the balance, but that balance is very difficult to find, as I was saying before, because there is a lot of censorship against phenomena that might go against gender equality, like I was mentioning before, sexual harassment in armies, for instance. So let me finish with this. I think that when we think about what feminism and gender studies have told us about war, we see that clearly wars can redefine gender relations. There is a potential. We've seen that, for instance, after the First World War and after the Second World War, where, for instance, women were granted voting rights, after the wars. But at the same time, what a great number of feminist scholars have said is that wars reinforce patriarchal ideologies. And that they make gender inequality worse because they feed so much on these specific masculinity and femininity images I was talking about earlier. And I think we really have to pay attention to the work of those feminists because they really raise our attention to the links between those role models I was talking about and war. And we should be aware of this and pay attention to this, not to be overwhelmed by them. And finally, I think that what feminists do, and that is very, very important, is to show us that it's not just physical violence that we should pay attention to. There are different forms of violence, as I'm sure you know. There is structural violence, there is symbolic violence, there is epistemic violence, epistemological violence, and so on and so forth. And feminists tell us that if we want to understand or put a stop to physical violence, we have to pay attention to the other forms of violence. So, for instance, if we want to stop physical violence, like sexual violence against women, for instance, we have to pay attention to the cultural violence and symbolic violence that underpins them, like, for instance, the stereotypes around women's bodies and women's honor and women's purity and so on and so forth. And we also have to pay attention to the structural violence that underpins sexual violence. So, for instance, the inequality in societies, the inequality in wealth and in power and in privilege between men and women, for instance. So, what feminists tell us is that peace, if we want peace, it's not just the silence of the weapons we have to, look for. We also have to fight against these other forms of violence. Otherwise, the society we live in will never be just. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've spoken too long, I'm sorry.
No problem. So, thank you very much, Élise, for this talk, which I think has been enlightening and provided lots of food for thoughts, broadened our perspective, and as I expected, also challenged some assumption we may have had about gender roles and the way in which war interacts with gender. So I'm going to, exploit my privilege as the chair to just shoot one question, which is going to be short and brutal, like life in the state of nature, basically. But I've been wondering, and then we open the floor for questions, of course. But I've been wondering, one thing you've mentioned is about the fact that actually war opens up a window of opportunity for change. And after the war, there is resistance, of course, to keep this change ongoing and revert back to the previous status. Yet sometimes we see that some of this change actually sticks to the society after the war. So I'm wondering if you could give us some hints about the elements that actually make some changes able to stick after the war. Is because maybe women get access to tools of mobilization and organization through the war and are able to use that after the war? Is because maybe society acquires some degree of social maturity about the added value? Well, I'm skeptical as well, but you're an expert, so I'm making a question to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefano. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. What we see mostly happening during wars is that women gain economic power. They do not get so much political power or social power even. They get economic power. Why? Simply because they take up jobs that, men could not, fulfill anymore because they are fighting on the front line or they are maimed or dead or, incapacitated. And sometimes they also take jobs that are new. So, for instance, preparing ammunitions. Which is, for instance, the case in Ukraine today. And what happens, I think, is that in case those jobs well, first of all, have been significant in the war effort, like we saw during the Second World War in particular. And also when it's not possible for men to go back immediately after the end of the war to those jobs, then women tend to keep these. And we know after the First and the Second World War, in particular in Western Europe, what we saw is that voting rights were given to women as a reward, for, keeping the economies going, during the wars. So I think this is a clear sign that the economic contribution, is what pays most.
Ok, thank you very much for that. And now we open the floor. Apriamo alle domande, sentitevi liberi di farle appunto in italiano perché tanto abbiamo la traduzione simultanea, quindi siamo pronti. Grazie.
Grazie mille, la faccio in italiano così la faccio un po' più breve. Davvero grazie per la presentazione, è stata davvero molto molto interessante. Mi chiedevo un po' nella prospettiva in più invece del post-conflitto, quanto invece tutte appunto queste caratteristiche che ha presentato all'interno della sua presentazione influiscano anche nel coinvolgimento delle donne nei processi di peace building e nello specifico delle donne combattenti nei processi invece di disarmo, smobilitazione e reintegro che anche da quanto ci dice la letteratura non coinvolgono particolarmente questa categoria considerata ancora così vulnerabile. Ecco, grazie.
Sorry, the post-conflict question is a very interesting one. What we see, first of all, is that mostly most of the local reconstruction work and reconciliation work is done by women in post-conflict societies. But that work is very often small scale and done voluntarily, without funding, and without recognition, of either the local politicians or the national politicians. What women have been able to do after the conflict is very often to use the international community in order to advocate for them and support their work. But the problem is that the international community's investment in post-conflict societies is not necessarily very long-term. So they will have support for a few years, and then that support will wane, and it will be very difficult for them to stay there and to continue their actions. At the political level and in terms of peace negotiations, for instance, it's a disaster. Let me tell it like it is. There is a lot of talk at the UN level of including women negotiators and women mediators and so on and so forth. It's purely aesthetic, if you want. It's at the very superficial level. If you look at current, the peace agreements signed since 1990, since the end of the Cold War, you have around 15% of those peace agreements that included women negotiators or women mediators. And this is, I want to stress something that, of course, here we're talking about feminism, but I would like to stress something that is very important. It's the lack of representativity of peace negotiators and peace mediators. It's not just women who are not represented. It's minorities. It's youth. It's, people who belong to linguistic minorities or geographic minorities and so on and so forth. So there is a massive work to be done, both at national and international level, for peace processes to be more representative. And I think that women, of course, it's a huge issue. And a lot of feminist scholars say we have to include more women because women think about those minorities. They think about youth and so on and so forth, which might or might not be always true, but I think we have to think also beyond this idea of women, because also something that is very worrying is that around 15% of peace negotiators and peace mediators are women. But who are those women? They are very often, English-speaking, New York familiar women. They come from very privileged background. They are very internationalized and so on and so forth. So they do not really represent the local populations. So the question is not so much, do we include women, but whose women are we including?
I think I'll talk directly in English. So yeah, we just talked about war and women. And today war, I think, if you look at Ukraine or even in Palestine, it's a lot more of drone strikes or airstrikes, or even more based on intelligence. Well, don't you think that all of this is something that doesn't require all this physicality and manly characteristics that were needed in war, in World War I, World War II, and past wars, but that today women could also be drafted just like men into conflict? But do you think that society today, in a state like Italy that is at peace today, or in Europe, is ready to think that women are also capable of going at war?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think mentalities are changing, but very slowly. For instance, if you think, you're right to say that nowadays many wars are conducted almost at a distance. When you think about, for instance, drone operators, if you think about how the US Army operates, for instance, when they strike in Yemen or when they strike in Afghanistan, very often the drone operators are somewhere in Ohio or Iowa or, somewhere like this. And many of these drone operators are women, actually. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, which are that they pay attention to detail and they have, in some circumstances, better observation skills, which are very required for drone operators, and so on and so forth. So mentalities are changing at that level, but not at all levels. For instance, I can give you another example. For war-fighting planes, like aircrafts or helicopters, the technology is designed for and by men. So, for instance, there is this myth that that women are not as good as flying helicopters or airplanes than men, but it's because everything, like the cockpit, the seats and everything, is done for the body of a man. And so it means that for women, it takes like more effort to, reach the commands, for instance, or they are less comfortable in the seats and things like that. So it really depends on what we are talking about. Then, with regard to the second part of your question regarding the acceptance of women as fighters and so on and so forth, it is very interesting to see, for instance, in Ukraine, at the beginning of the war, I think there were something like around 30% of the population that thought that women would be as good fighters as men. Nowadays, that percentage is at more than 70%. So I think that mentalities can, evolve very rapidly in that respect. But on the other hand, pacifists will tell you, but is that a good thing? That then we would send women to war. I don't know, but I think certainly recognizing that women have the same capacities, or sometimes even better capacities in some cases, than men, it would certainly be a progress.
Hi, thanks for the chat and for the presentation. For the opportunity to discuss it. I don't know, maybe it's a silly question, but I was curious to have your thoughts about one of the last points you mentioned about the divisions within feminism groups, especially in Europe and after the war in Ukraine. I know Ukrainian feminists that are pro-war. I know Ukrainian feminists that are pro-peace, but what I notice is that it's much harder to get a platform or a unified platform for discussion. I mean, I don't know whether this is necessarily a bad thing, because there is also like this idea that like feminists should be united to make their voice count, which like women are as different as men, so why should they all have the same idea? But I do wanted to pick your brain on like, what do you think could be the consequence of this divide? Like, do you think that could be a drawback or a pushback also on women's rights throughout Europe and especially in Western Europe because of this divide? Or do you think it might enrich feminism discussion or feminist thinking within the group? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question too. I am in the optimist camp. I think it will enrich feminism, and one of the reasons I think that is that for too long, Western European feminism has been silencing Eastern feminism, and the narratives about the war, about women's rights, have been dominated by Western European feminists, and the perspective of Eastern European, in particular, feminists, have been totally silenced. And I think the recognition, to me, feminism is essentially about recognizing diversity and that we all are different and all have different needs and perspectives and interests. And but we have to not just acknowledge that diversity, but also respect everybody, and in what they think. And I think it's a good lesson for Western feminists to hear what others have to say. It's very easy from the comfort of our Western homes to say, "Oh, I'm against war," right? It takes a lot more courage if you are Ukrainian to say, "I'm against war," right now. And I think recognizing that diversity is very important for feminism. I think feminism generally has been through a period of crisis for a while now. Not crisis in the sense it's going to disappear, but in the sense we are certainly recognizing that there is not just one feminism, but multiple feminisms. And so I quoted the division on war, but there are other divisions, for instance, on women in general. Should feminism be about women or should it be about everybody? Should it be intersectional? Because when we defend women in general, we forget that among women, there are very privileged women and very poor women. There are able women, disabled women, and so on and so forth. And that there are also oppressors among the women, that women are not necessarily all oppressed, and that among the oppressed, there are also men, and so on and so forth. And those debates have become more prominent recently in feminist circles, and I think that's really a good thing. And it's fine that some people say, "Oh, my objective as a feminist is to defend women and only women," and others would tell you, "My objective as a feminist is that everybody is equal, regardless of their gender, sexual orientation, religion, and so on and so forth." It's fine. And so I think that this is a good crisis to have, if you want, to take stock of the diversity and also the fact that it's fine that we are not all of us are fighting for the same thing. It's fine that not all of us are focused on one type of oppression, but some of us are focusing on different types of oppression, for instance. And so to me, it's really important, and it proves that feminism is finally maturing. It went through a lot of different phases, but I think that for a very long time it was completely dominated by Western feminism, and many were not happy with this, especially women from the global south, who were saying, "You are talking about global sisterhood, but you don't have a clue what we are going through. And you are talking in our name, and you are talking in New York or in Brussels or wherever, but you are stealing our voices, because this is not what we want to say." And so I think that this acknowledgement that there is that multiplicity is actually a very good thing, and it's making feminism stronger. Nothing tells us that feminism should be united On the contrary, I think what makes feminism strong, it's diversity. I don't know if I've answered you. This is my positive answer.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a PhD student. My work really much overlaps with your theoretical stance and really much align with what you've said so far. I was just puzzled by your employment of feminism as a sort of a broad, unique category, because there are different schools of thoughts. So I was like, I'm not sure I would consider it the most appropriate label. I would maybe narrow it down, because I'm not sure maybe radical feminism would align with our own perspective and theoretical stance. So I'm not really sure I would talk about feminism overall. I would maybe talk about, I don't know, post-colonial feminism or critical masculinities. That's just a suggestion, like my viewpoint.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, a few years ago, I co-edited the first handbook in feminist peace research, where we have more than 40 chapters. And I can tell you, and like 80-something authors. And so it was like a massive endeavor. And we had those debates a lot, because the authors could not agree with one another. We had fights about, should we talk about motherhood or not? Should we have chapters about men? Should we have chapters about sexual minorities? And so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting question. To me, I qualify myself as an intersectional feminist. And so some feminists will tell me, you're not a feminist if you are intersectional. Because intersectional feminist means that what I care about is that I care about the suffering and disempowerment of individuals depending on their specific status in society. So that can be, it's not just depending on gender, it also depends on their skin color, their socioeconomic status, their religion, and so on and so forth. And I think everybody should be equal regardless of their skin color, socioeconomic status, and so on and so forth. Of course, it's ideal, but idealistic. But this is my theoretical stance, if you want. But also because of that stance, I think that everybody should be able to, have their different understanding of feminism. Why would be who would decide what is feminism and what is not feminism? And I think one of the main key values of feminism is tolerance. And it can be, I disagree with you, but like Voltaire would say, but I will fight for your right to say it, although I disagree with you. And I think it's very much what many feminists think. Not everybody, of course. And there is also a divide which I haven't spoken about, which is the divide between feminist movements and women's movements. There are many women's movements that are extremely patriarchal and traditionalist, right? And that therefore are not supported by feminists. And it creates another source of division within that, I don't know how to call it, sphere of activism, if you want. So I personally don't think we should let things, grow and have their own life, if you want. If you're interested in these issues, I did a bit of self-promotion. It's not showing anymore, but the last slide was a textbook that I co-authored and published last year, where we, with my co-author, where we talk about those issues. Yes, this one. If you can't find it or whatever, you're very free to get in touch with me, and I will send it to you. Don't tell my publisher.
But I'm also sure we can perhaps get I'm sure that we can get a copy for the library here that could be also be appreciated. So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank one more time Élise Feron. Grazie Élise for your presentation. E anche per averci ricordato che le utopie servono insomma a continuare a muoversi verso qualcosa di meglio, ecco, quindi grazie a tutti e buona serata.